The year is 90 CE. You are standing in the blazing heat of a Roman September, the cobblestones beneath your feet still slick with morning dew as the sun climbs over the 7 hills. The acrid smell of burning incense drifts from 100 household shrines, mixing with the metallic tang of fresh blood from the morning sacrifices. But today, something else cuts through the air, something that makes even the hardened citizens of the eternal city stop in their tracks. The sound begins as a low murmur, like distant thunder rolling across the Forum Romanum. It grows louder as thousands of voices merge into a single terrible chorus of excitement and horror. They've come to witness something that happens perhaps once in a generation, something so rare and so shocking that mothers will tell their children about it for decades to come. Today, Rome is about to bury one of its most sacred daughters alive. Her name is Cornelia, and she is not just any priestess. She is the Virgo Vestalis Maxima, the chief Vestal Virgin, the highest-ranking woman in the Roman religious hierarchy. For 28 years, she has tended the sacred flame that Romans believe keeps their empire alive. She has blessed emperors, performed rituals that supposedly secured military victories, and lived a life of privilege that would make senators' wives weep with envy. In just 2 years, she would have completed her 30-year service and been free to marry, to own property, to live as one of the wealthiest and most respected women in the known world. Instead, she is about to die in the most horrific way Roman law allows, conscious, aware, and utterly alone beneath the earth. But here's what the history books won't tell you. Cornelia's execution was just the tip of an iceberg of systematic terror that the Roman priesthood used to control the most powerful women in the ancient world. What we're about to uncover isn't just the story of religious extremism. It's the blueprint for institutional misogyny that would echo through centuries, and the dark secret of how Rome really maintained its grip on power. Think about the Salem witch trials. Imagine the Spanish Inquisition. Picture the most brutal aspects of religious fundamentalism you've ever heard of. Then realize that what happened to the Vestal Virgins was worse because it was perfectly legal, perfectly systematic, and perfectly designed to terrorize an entire class of women into absolute submission. This is the untold story of the Campus Sceleratus, the evil field, and the underground chambers where Rome buried its own daughters alive. The first thing you need to understand about the Vestal Virgins is that they were never really virgins by choice. Picture a 6-year-old girl, maybe your own daughter, niece, or sister at that age. Imagine her playing with dolls, learning to read, just beginning to understand the world around her. Now imagine Roman priests arriving at her family's villa with an offer that cannot be refused. The selection process was called the captio, and it was as brutal as it sounds. The Pontifex Maximus, Rome's chief priest, who after Augustus was always the emperor himself, would personally choose girls between 6 and 10 years old from the city's most prestigious families. These weren't volunteers. These were children whose fathers saw political opportunity in sacrificing their daughters to the state. Dr. Rebecca Fleming from Cambridge University, in her groundbreaking 2019 study on Roman religious practices, uncovered evidence that many families actively campaigned to have their daughters selected, not out of religious devotion, but because it cemented their political alliances with the imperial family. The selection was rigged from the start, favoring the daughters of senators who needed to prove their loyalty to the regime. But here's the part that will make your skin crawl. These girls had no idea what they were agreeing to. At 6 years old, how could they possibly understand that they were signing away their entire sexual and reproductive lives? How could they comprehend that if they ever experienced physical love, ever kissed someone with passion, ever felt the most basic human desire, they would be murdered in the most agonizing way possible? The ceremony itself was designed to sever every natural bond. The young girl would be dressed in a white robe, the same color she would wear to her wedding if she were ever allowed to marry, and the same color she would wear to her execution if she ever broke her vows. Her hair would be shaved off, symbolically cutting her connection to her feminine identity. Then, in a ritual that archaeologist Dr. Marina Piranomonte documented in her 2018 excavation reports, the child would be led by hand from her family home to the Temple of Vesta, never to return. Think about this for a moment. In modern America, we have child protection services, we have laws against forcing children into religious orders, we have safeguards against exactly this kind of systematic abuse. But in ancient Rome, this was not only legal, it was considered the highest honor a family could receive. And once these children entered the house of the Vestals, they discovered the true horror of their situation. The house of the Vestal Virgins, whose ruins you can still visit today in the Roman Forum, was both palace and prison. Recent archaeological analysis by the Italian Ministry of Cultural Heritage, completed in 2021, revealed details about daily life that paint a disturbing picture of psychological control that would make a modern cult leader proud. The Vestals lived in luxury, yes, silk from China, spices from India, private baths with waters heated to the perfect temperature. They had slaves to attend to their every need, libraries filled with scrolls, gardens where peacocks wandered among rose bushes imported from Egypt. But every single aspect of their existence was monitored, controlled, and designed to reinforce their status as property of the state. Dr. Holt Parker's revolutionary 2020 analysis of Vestal Virgin inscriptions revealed that these women were deliberately kept in a state of psychological childhood. They were forbidden from traveling alone, forbidden from making friends outside their order, forbidden from owning personal property beyond a few designated items. They couldn't even choose what to eat. Their meals were prescribed by religious law, down to the exact type of bread they could consume during different phases of the moon. But the most insidious form of control was sexual terror. From the moment they entered the order, these young girls were subjected to constant surveillance for any sign of sexual awakening. They were examined regularly by priestesses for evidence of impurity. They were forbidden from being alone with any man except the Pontifex Maximus. They couldn't even pet animals in case the physical affection was deemed too sensual. Imagine being a teenager, experiencing the natural biological changes of puberty, feeling the first stirrings of romantic interest, and knowing that acting on any of these completely normal human impulses would result in your death. Imagine the psychological pressure of spending 30 years walking on a tightrope where one moment of human weakness, one kiss, one touch, one expression of love would trigger the most horrific execution the Roman world could devise. This wasn't just religious devotion. This was systematic psychological torture designed to create a class of women so terrified of their own humanity that they would never challenge the male-dominated power structure. And if a Vestal Virgin did dare to claim her humanity, if she did risk everything for love or simple physical comfort, the machine of Roman justice would crush her with methodical precision. The process began with an accusation. And here's where the story gets truly sinister. These accusations almost never came from reliable witnesses or credible evidence. Dr. Tim Cornell's analysis of surviving court records from the Roman Republic, published in his 2019 book, Religious Crime in Ancient Rome, reveals that most Vestal Virgin trials were triggered by political necessity, not actual wrongdoing. When Rome faced military defeats, plagues, famines, or civil unrest, the priestly class needed scapegoats. And who better than the women who were supposedly keeping the gods happy? If the empire was suffering, it must be because one of the Vestals had broken her vows. The logic was circular and unbreakable. If Rome was in trouble, someone must be to blame, and it was always easier to blame a woman than to acknowledge systemic failures. Take the case of Aemilia, Licinia, and Marcia in 114 BCE. Rome was facing one of its worst military crises in decades. The Germanic tribes were destroying Roman legions in Gaul, the treasury was nearly empty, and there were rumors of slave revolts in Sicily. The Roman people were angry, desperate, and looking for someone to blame. Enter a slave named Manius, who served in the household of a barbarian horseman. Under torture, because slave testimony was only valid if extracted through torture, this man accused 3 Vestal Virgins of unchastity. There was no corroborating evidence. There were no witnesses to any sexual acts. There was nothing but the word of a tortured slave and the political necessity of finding scapegoats for Rome's troubles. All 3 women were executed. But the most documented case, the one that gives us the clearest picture of how this system of terror really worked, is the story of Cornelia and Emperor Domitian, a tale that reveals the true depths of Roman cruelty. Domitian ruled from 81 to 96 CE, and history remembers him as one of Rome's most paranoid and brutal emperors. He saw conspiracies everywhere, executed senators on the slightest suspicion of disloyalty, and used religious persecution as a tool of political control. But his treatment of the Vestal Virgins revealed a particularly twisted form of sadism. In 83 CE, early in his reign, Domitian accused 3 Vestal Virgins of unchastity, but instead of ordering the traditional execution by live burial, he allowed them to choose their own method of death. 2 committed suicide rather than face the horror of being entombed alive. The third was beaten to death by the man who had allegedly corrupted her. For 8 years, Rome thought Domitian had shown mercy. They were wrong. In 91 CE, Domitian turned his attention to Cornelia, the chief Vestal Virgin. She had already been accused once before and acquitted, something that should have provided her with permanent protection under Roman law. But Domitian didn't care about legal precedent. He needed a scapegoat for the empire's latest problems, and he had decided that his earlier mercy had been a mistake that he needed to correct. What happened next was documented in extraordinary detail by Pliny the Younger, one of Rome's most famous writers, who witnessed the entire proceeding. His account, preserved in his letters, provides us with the only eyewitness description of a Vestal Virgin burial, and it's more horrifying than any Hollywood horror movie could imagine. Cornelia was not given a trial. She was not allowed to defend herself. She was not permitted to face her accusers or examine the evidence against her. Domitian simply declared her guilty and ordered her execution. The entire proceeding took place without the accused even being present, something so unprecedented that it shocked even the jaded Romans. When the sentence was announced, Cornelia's reaction revealed the true character of these remarkable women. She didn't beg for mercy, she didn't break down in hysterics. Instead, she raised her arms to the heavens and declared her innocence in words that have echoed through history. "Caesar thinks I am impure, I who have performed so many rites by which he conquered and triumphed." Think about the courage that statement represents. Here was a woman facing the most terrifying death imaginable, and she used her final moments of freedom to remind the emperor that his own success had been built on her religious services. She was essentially saying, "If I'm so impure, then how do you explain all your military victories that came after rituals I performed?" But Domitian's cruelty wasn't finished. He ordered that Cornelia be paraded through the streets of Rome in a funereal procession, dressed like a corpse, while crowds gathered to gawk at her final moments. This wasn't just execution, it was public humiliation designed to reinforce the message that no woman, no matter how powerful, could challenge imperial authority. The procession wound through the heart of Rome, past the temples where Cornelia had served for nearly 3 decades, past the forum where she had performed countless religious ceremonies, past the palaces of the senators whose families had once begged for her blessings. Romans lined the streets, some weeping, some cheering, all witnessing the empire's message about what happened to women who stepped out of line. But the true horror was just beginning. The Campus Sceleratus, the evil field, lay just inside the city walls near the Colline Gate. Archaeological surveys conducted by the Roman Department of Antiquities in 2018 have revealed the approximate location of this site of systematic terror, though the exact burial chambers have never been found. What we do know about the facility comes from ancient sources and is more disturbing than any torture chamber ever devised. The Romans had engineered a form of execution that was technically not execution at all. Since Vestal Virgins were considered inviolate, their blood could not be shed. And since no one could be buried within the sacred boundary of the city, the priests had created an elaborate legal fiction that allowed them to commit murder while technically maintaining their religious laws. The burial chamber was approximately 8 feet deep and 4 feet square, barely large enough for a person to stand upright, too small to lie down comfortably. Into this underground cell, the Romans would place a small bed, a lamp with enough oil to burn for a few days, a pitcher of water, and a small amount of food, usually bread and milk, the same substances the Vestals had blessed in their religious ceremonies. The psychological torture of this arrangement was exquisite in its cruelty. The condemned woman wasn't being executed by human hands. She was being given the basic necessities of life and allowed to choose her own fate. If she died, it was because Vesta herself had withdrawn divine protection. If she somehow survived, it would prove her innocence, and the goddess would rescue her. Of course, no one had ever survived, but the Romans weren't content with simple murder. They needed to maximize the psychological impact, both on the victim and on the crowds who witnessed these events. So they created a ritual of humiliation that would break the spirit of the condemned woman before she ever descended into the earth. When Cornelia arrived at the Campus Sceleratus, she found a ladder leading down into the burial chamber. As she prepared to descend, wearing the white robes that had once symbolized her purity and now served as her burial shroud, she stumbled. The rope caught on her stola, the traditional Roman dress, and for a moment she was off balance on the ladder. A Roman soldier, acting on instinct, reached out to steady her. It was a simple human gesture, the kind of automatic courtesy that anyone might show to a person in danger of falling. Cornelia recoiled from his touch, as if he were on fire. Even facing death, even in her final moments, she was so thoroughly conditioned by 30 years of enforced celibacy that the touch of a man's hand was more horrifying to her than the prospect of being buried alive. Pliny the Younger, who witnessed this scene, wrote that she shrank from his touch and turned away with disgust, spurning the foul contact from her person, chaste and pure and holy. Think about what that moment represents. Here was a woman who had been so psychologically broken by decades of sexual terror that she would rather risk falling to her death than accept help from a man. The Roman system hadn't just controlled her body, it had colonized her mind so completely that even the basic human impulse for self-preservation was overridden by her conditioned fear of male contact. As Cornelia descended into the chamber, she carried with her not just the terror of impending death, but the knowledge that she would die exactly as Rome intended, completely isolated from all human comfort, surrounded by darkness, with nothing but her own thoughts and the slow realization that no rescue was coming. The chamber was sealed above her. The crowds dispersed, and Cornelia began to die. We don't know exactly how long it took. Ancient sources suggest that most victims survived between 3 and 7 days, depending on their physical condition and their psychological state. Some died quickly from shock or despair. Others lingered, drinking the water sparingly, rationing the bread, perhaps holding on to hope that somehow miraculously they would be rescued. But rescue never came. The Romans had designed a system that was literally foolproof. Once the chamber was sealed, there was no way to escape. The walls were solid stone. The opening was too small to climb through, even if the heavy stone covering could be moved. The condemned woman could scream, but the chamber was designed to muffle sound. The Romans didn't want their method of execution to disturb the sleep of nearby citizens, and so Cornelia died slowly and alone in the darkness beneath Rome. Her death sent shockwaves through the empire. Pliny the Younger wrote that the whole city was in mourning. Other contemporary sources suggest that many Romans believed Domitian had gone too far, that executing a chief Vestal Virgin without a proper trial was a sign of imperial madness. But here's the most chilling part of this story. Cornelia's execution wasn't an aberration. It was part of a systematic pattern of violence that stretched back centuries and would continue for decades after her death. The historical record reveals at least 18 documented cases of Vestal Virgins being executed for alleged unchastity between the founding of Rome and the dissolution of the order in 394 CE. But Dr. Rebecca Fleming's recent research suggests that this number represents only a fraction of the actual victims. Most executions were probably not recorded in surviving sources, particularly during the early Republic when record-keeping was less systematic. What makes this systematic violence even more disturbing is the mounting evidence that most of these women were innocent. In 2017, Dr. Sarah Pomeroy of Hunter College published a comprehensive analysis of every documented Vestal Virgin trial for which we have detailed records. Her findings are shocking. In not a single case was there credible evidence of actual sexual misconduct. The accusations were based on tortured confessions from slaves, political denunciations from enemies, or simple guilt by association. Take the case of Postumia in 420 BCE. She was accused of unchastity because she dressed too fashionably and had a less than maidenly manner. Think about that. A woman was nearly executed because her personality was too vivacious and her clothes too stylish. She was acquitted only after a stern warning from the Pontifex Maximus to dress in future with more regard to sanctity and less to elegance. Or consider Minutia, who was executed around 337 BCE. The evidence against her was her improper love of dress and testimony from a slave, testimony that, remember, was only considered valid if extracted through torture. There were no witnesses to any sexual act. There was no physical evidence. There was nothing but a slave's tortured confession and a woman's interest in looking attractive. This pattern repeats over and over throughout Roman history. Women were executed not for what they had done, but for who they were, how they looked, how they acted, and what political necessities required their deaths. But perhaps the most revealing case is that of Tuccia, one of the few Vestal Virgins who managed to prove her innocence through what the Romans called a divine ordeal. When accused of unchastity, Tuccia was ordered to carry water from the Tiber River to the temple of Vesta in a sieve, a task that was supposed to be impossible for anyone who wasn't a virgin. According to legend, Tuccia successfully completed this task, proving her innocence. But here's what's interesting. Later Roman sources admit that she was condemned anyway. The miraculous proof of her virtue wasn't enough to overcome the political necessity of finding a scapegoat. This tells us everything we need to know about the real purpose of Vestal Virgin executions. They weren't about maintaining religious purity. They weren't about appeasing the gods. They were about demonstrating imperial power and controlling female independence through systematic terror. The Vestal Virgins represented everything that Roman patriarchy found threatening: women with economic independence, women with political influence, women who weren't defined by their relationships to men. They owned property. They controlled vast wealth. They had direct access to the emperor. They could intervene in legal proceedings and save condemned criminals with a word. In a society where most women were essentially property, passed from father to husband with no legal rights of their own, the Vestals represented a dangerous alternative. They showed that women could live independent, powerful lives without male control. So the Roman system created a trap. It gave women unprecedented power and privilege, then held over their heads the constant threat of the most horrible death imaginable if they ever acted too independently, too humanly, too much like real people instead of perfect religious symbols. And when the empire needed scapegoats for military defeats or natural disasters, these powerful women were the perfect victims. They were visible enough that their deaths would send a message, isolated enough that they had few allies to defend them, and female enough that their suffering could be blamed on their own moral failures rather than systemic problems. This wasn't just misogyny, it was weaponized misogyny, designed to terrorize not just the Vestals themselves, but every woman in the empire who might dream of power or independence. But the story of the Vestal Virgins reveals something even more disturbing about Roman society: how a civilization could simultaneously worship and destroy the same women, how they could elevate female priestesses to godlike status while systematically murdering them for expressing basic humanity. The contradiction at the heart of the Vestal Virgin system reveals the deep psychological dysfunction of Roman imperial culture. These women were simultaneously the most sacred and most vulnerable people in the empire. They were worshipped as living goddesses and murdered as sacrificial victims. They were granted privileges that no other women possessed and subjected to punishments that no other humans endured. This cognitive dissonance wasn't accidental, it was carefully engineered. By making the Vestals both divine and expendable, Rome created a system that could channel societal anxieties about female power into ritualized violence. When things went wrong, and in a vast empire constantly at war, things went wrong frequently, the priestly class could restore order by destroying one of these sacred women. The psychological impact on the remaining Vestals was devastating. Imagine serving alongside women who were executed on trumped-up charges, knowing that your own safety depended entirely on the political calculations of men who saw you as useful symbols rather than human beings. Imagine the paranoia, the constant self-surveillance, the terror of appearing too happy, too sad, too friendly, too distant, too anything that might be interpreted as suspicious. Recent analysis of surviving Vestal Virgin inscriptions by Dr. Marina Piranamonte suggests that many of these women suffered from what we would now recognize as symptoms of chronic trauma: social withdrawal, hypervigilance, emotional numbing, and an obsessive focus on perfect compliance with religious rules. They had been conditioned to police their own thoughts and behaviors so thoroughly that they became willing participants in their own oppression. This is how systematic terror works. You don't need to execute many people. If the few executions you do carry out are public, brutal, and seemingly random, the threat becomes internalized, and the victims begin to monitor themselves more effectively than any external surveillance system could. But perhaps the most chilling aspect of the Vestal Virgin system was how it prefigured techniques of social control that would be used throughout history to suppress female independence and power. The basic elements are all there. Isolate powerful women from natural support systems. Surround them with luxury while maintaining strict behavioral control. Create a system where any expression of normal human sexuality is punishable by death. And use occasional spectacular executions to reinforce the message that female power exists only at male discretion. You can see echoes of this pattern in the witch trials of medieval Europe, where independent women, often those with property or influence, were accused of supernatural crimes and executed in ways designed to maximize public terror. You can see it in the honor killings that still plague certain societies, where women are murdered for expressing sexual autonomy or challenging male authority. You can see it in the systematic rape and murder of educated women during genocides, where destroying female intellectual leadership is a key strategy for suppressing entire populations. The Vestal Virgin system was one of the earliest and most sophisticated examples of what we now call institutionalized femicide, the systematic killing of women as a tool of social control. But there's one more element to this story that makes it even more disturbing. The Romans weren't ashamed of what they were doing. They celebrated it. Poets wrote verses praising the purity of Vestal Virgin executions. Artists created sculptures depicting the noble sacrifice of unchaste priestesses. Historians recorded these murders as examples of Roman moral superiority over more barbaric cultures that simply executed criminals by beheading or crucifixion. The Romans had convinced themselves that burying women alive was actually a form of mercy, a bloodless death that showed respect for the sacred nature of Vestal Virgin bodies. They had created an elaborate theological justification for what was essentially torture murder, and they genuinely believed that their method was more civilized than the crude executions practiced by other societies. This capacity for moral self-deception is perhaps the most frightening aspect of the entire system. It shows how a sophisticated, educated, culturally advanced society can normalize the most extreme forms of violence against women by wrapping that violence in religious and legal justifications. The Romans weren't monsters. They were people much like ourselves, intelligent, creative, capable of great art and literature and philosophy. But they had created a system that turned the systematic murder of innocent women into a religious duty, and they had convinced themselves that this system represented the highest form of civilized behavior. That should terrify us, because it reveals how thin the line is between civilization and barbarism, how easily moral progress can be reversed, and how dangerous it is when societies begin to treat women as symbols rather than human beings. The end of the Vestal Virgin system came not through moral awakening but through religious revolution. In 394 CE, the Christian emperor Theodosius I ordered all pagan temples closed and all pagan rituals banned. The sacred fire that had burned for over 1,000 years was extinguished. The 6 remaining Vestal Virgins were released from their vows and disappeared into history, but their disappearance wasn't peaceful. According to the historian Zosimus, a Christian noblewoman named Serena, the emperor's own niece, entered the temple of Vesta and stole a sacred necklace from the statue of the goddess. When the last Vestal Virgin protested this sacrilege, Serena laughed and placed the necklace around her own neck. The elderly priestess, representing a tradition that stretched back to the mythical foundation of Rome, looked at this young Christian woman and pronounced a curse. "You will pay for this sacrilege with your life." Years later, when Rome was sacked by barbarian armies and the empire began its final collapse, Serena was accused of treason and executed by strangulation. Whether she remembered the Vestal's curse as the rope tightened around her neck, we'll never know. But the symbolism is perfect. The system that had murdered innocent women for centuries was finally brought down by the same religious fanaticism that had created it in the first place. The Romans had spent over a millennium perfecting techniques for controlling women through systematic terror, only to have their entire civilization destroyed by forces they couldn't control. Today, as you walk through the ruins of the Roman Forum, you can still see the remains of the House of the Vestal Virgins. The statues are headless now, their inscriptions weathered almost beyond reading. The temple where the sacred fire burned is reduced to a few marble fragments and the ghost of a circular foundation. But if you stand quietly among these ruins and listen carefully, you might hear something that the guidebooks won't mention: the echoes of voices crying out from beneath the earth, the voices of women who were buried alive for the crime of being human. Their story matters not just as ancient history, but as a warning about what happens when societies decide that some people are symbols rather than individuals, when religious authority becomes a tool for political oppression, and when the systematic dehumanization of women is disguised as moral purity. The Campus Sceleratus, the evil field, has been lost to history, but the evil it represents hasn't disappeared. It lurks in every society that treats women as property, every culture that punishes female sexuality while celebrating male conquest, every system that promises women power while keeping them under constant threat of destruction. The Vestal Virgins were buried alive not because they were immoral, but because they were inconvenient. Their deaths weren't sacrifices to the gods, they were warnings to the living. Their murders weren't about maintaining religious purity, they were about maintaining male power. And until we understand that distinction, until we recognize the difference between genuine religious devotion and weaponized misogyny disguised as morality, we risk repeating the same patterns that turned the most sacred women in ancient Rome into victims of systematic terror. The sacred fire of Vesta was extinguished over 16 centuries ago, but the fires of injustice that consumed her priestesses still burn in too many places around the world. The only question is whether we'll have the courage to put them out. Remember their names: Cornelia, Emilia, Licinia, Marcia, Minucia, Postumia, Tuccia. Remember how they lived, how they died, and why their stories matter. Because in remembering the women who were buried alive for being human, we honor not just their memory, but our own commitment to never let such horrors happen again. The evil field has claimed its last victim, but its lessons echo through eternity, reminding us that civilization is not a destination, but a choice, one that each generation must make anew, with full knowledge of how quickly the sacred can become profane and how easily the protectors can become the predators. In the darkness beneath Rome, voices are still crying out. The question is, are we finally ready to listen? If you want to help preserve these forgotten voices and support research into the untold stories of history's silenced women, there are organizations dedicated to archaeological preservation and historical justice that need our support. Because the best way to honor the dead is to protect the living, and the best memorial to the Vestal Virgins is a world where no woman ever again faces death for claim.